Hi everyone, my name's Belinda Scala. I'm the library manager here at the Working Class Movement Library. First of all, thank you for coming. It's fantastic that you're here today for our Frow Memorial Lecture. So I'll say a little bit about what the Frow Memorial Lecture is, and then there's a little bit of housekeeping before I hand over to Ewan. So the Frow Memorial Lecture, the aim of that really is to obviously commemorate our founders, Edmund and Ruth Frow, and it was their love of working class movements and their collection of all that material that founded the Working Class Movement Library and the archive and library collection that we have today. And we want to sort of honour their legacy. We still care for and add to and give free access to all of our collection. That is an amazing thing that Ruth and Eddie achieved that we are trying to carry on. Your support to our events obviously really helps us with that. We are a charity and there's lots of other ways that you can support us. So we have a membership scheme called Radical Readers where you can give a monthly or annual donation to the library to help us do what we do and to keep giving access to our collection. So today's Frow Memorial Lecture is being recorded. It's being live streamed on YouTube as well. So just for the people in the room, most people at home won't be able to see you, but they might hear you if you ask a question at the end. So if you don't want to be heard or don't want to engage in that, then please let us know. There shouldn't be a fire alarm, but if there is, obviously head towards the fire exit there and we'll assemble outside. And also please turn your phones off or have them on silent as well because it is being recorded. So I don't think there's any more to say really other than to introduce Ewan Gibbs. So Dr. Ewan Gibbs is a lecturer of global inequalities at University of Glasgow, and the Frow lecture today is Energy Workers and the Transformation in Britain. Thanks, Ewan.
Thanks very much to Belinda and Nathan and the team at the library for having me along, and thanks to all of you for giving up a quite nice summer evening, certainly by Glasgow standards anyway. Before I begin the lecture, I just wanted to say that it was an honour to be asked to come to such an important institution as the library, and also more specifically to give the Frow Memorial Lecture. Tony Simpson, who some of you might know from the Institute for Workers' Control, when he found out I was giving this lecture, sent me a pamphlet that the Frows had written in the early 1980s, and it was on the theme of democracy in the engineering union, which was a matter that was very important to both of them. Obviously, with Edmund having been an activist in the union and an advocate of a more democratic form of labour movement politics. The theme of democracy is also important in two slightly different ways in my talk today. Firstly, the quite familiar theme of democracy in the workplace and how that animated social and economic change in Britain in the second half of the 20th century, but also the important question of who controls and organises our energy supply and the implication that has for society, for the organisation of the economy and political power. Over the course of this lecture, we're going to think about half a century of transformations in Britain between the nationalisation of electricity and coal, at the time the most important areas of electricity production in the late 1940s, and the emergence of a privatised, liberalised energy sector in the 1990s. This was a period that was characterised by fundamental changes to the organisation of social life, to the organisation of production and life in the workplace, but also to the articulation of political and economic power. At the beginning of the lecture, I'm going to think about energy's place in the big stories that we tell about changes to Britain's society and economy. And I'll then introduce two more specific historical phases in the character of Britain's energy economy. The first one is a national energy economy that's formed through public ownership and the organisation of energy production by the state between the late 1940s and the early 1980s. The second is what happens when that structure of the energy economy is deconstructed by political choice and also by a class struggle waged from above. We're going to, through these periods, think about workers and their struggles. We'll think about labour and work in coal mining, in the construction sector, in the power station sector, and also in the emergent offshore oil and gas sector in the North Sea. So workers in their struggles on the one hand, the agency also of employers and management and political choices made at the level of the state are crucial to thinking about this period. Here's what it looks like if I was a more dry mainstream economic historian. This is what this period looks like in graph form. There's not too many graphs in this lecture, I promise, but I want to draw your attention to a couple of things. So, the first of these is this graph starts in 65. It's the best bit of consistent data we have, but if we started it in 50, coal would be even more dominant. So at this point, even in 65, we can see Britain's overwhelmingly a coal-fired economy. We then have up to 2000 coal being replaced by hydrocarbons. So the first of these is oil becoming the dominant fuel in Britain over the 1960s and retaining that position into the 1980s. And then we have gas from the North Sea initially. Most of us have got a gas boiler in our home. That's part of this process. Increasingly also electricity is generated by gas in Britain in the 1990s. The last significant change here is nuclear. Nuclear electricity comes to represent around 10% of Britain's entire energy generation in the 1990s. So not nearly as important actually as the fossil fuels. The last thing I just want to highlight here is frankly how unimportant in this entire time period renewables are. They become much more important afterwards. Here's what it actually looks like though. It looks like massive coal-fired power stations generating higher and higher volumes of electricity that power homes and factories and hospitals. It looks like large modernised coal mines that are connected to these power stations either through special purpose rail connections or in some cases like the Long Annet mine in Fife in eastern Scotland through mechanical conveyors that directly bring coal to these new power stations. It also looks like these giant concrete blocks, Trawsfynydd nuclear power station that was built in northwest Wales in the early 1960s to feed electricity to an increasingly energy-hungry country. And lastly, it looks like these imposing massive platforms in the North Sea, which start to provide important financial revenues from the oil industry to British government in the 1970s and 1980s, and come through gas to also play a really important role in fueling Britain's energy economy into the present day. These are all sectors which are characterised by extremities of heat, of scale, of danger in some cases, of unusual environments under the ground and out at sea. They have very distinctive work regimes which we're going to explore over this lecture. And I think it's important then to relate these work regimes, technologies, and energy generation systems to the dominant stories that we tell about Britain. Now, these are 4 flashpoints that I've picked out that I think characterise the half century in question. So, at the top, we have Nye Bevan visiting a hospital in Manchester to inaugurate the National Health Service in 1948. I think that's our dominant image of Reconstruction after the Second World War and the formation perhaps of a more just order in economic and social terms, a more secure order for workers and their families. Yet we should also remember that Bevan himself was a former coal miner. His government, the Labour government he was part of, expended far greater resources actually in nationalising energy through the coal mining sector and power generation, and was arguably far more exercised by ensuring that Britain's energy supply was maintained in this years than it was actually through the construction of the welfare state. Cranberry Street in swinging 60s London is an important image for how we think about the cultural changes that took place in Britain as Britain started to become more affluent, more cosmopolitan, more multicultural in the second half of the 20th century. But this was also the period of Harold Wilson's white heat of technology. The lights on the shops in Cranberry Street were powered increasingly by nuclear power stations like those giant concrete blocks at Trawsfynydd. We have a scene from Boys from the Black Stuff, that well-known presentation of poverty and mass unemployment in the northwest of England in the early 1980s, which is obviously intimately tied to changes to the organisation of Britain's industry, particularly the decline not just in coal mining but in coal-using economic activities that included railways, ports, steel making and other areas of industry. And lastly, we have the Millennium Dome. Yesterday I was horrified to find somebody in their mid-20s on Twitter learn that the O2 had been this important site of British cultural change in the year 2000, which I can unfortunately remember. But I think when we think about the Dome, we think about Britain's globalisation, we think about London being the centre of financial economic activity, we think about the building of an economy based on the services sector rather than the industrial sector. But this was also an economy which was fundamentally dependent on industrial processes, particularly on increasingly on the generation of industry from North Sea gas fields. And I think that should be important how we think about New Labour and its political economy too. And I think this then relates energy to the big stories that we tell, the big stories that historians tell about what Britain has looked like since the end of the Second World War. I think there's 4 important versions of Britain in sort of structural economic terms that are important to grapple with when we consider that. The first of these is the traditional story, if we want, of consensus, of the idea that at the end of the Second World War, Conservatives and Labour politicians came together and agreed on a mixed economy and the welfare state that Paul Addison immortalised in his well-known book, The Road to 1945. And since then, that version of consensus has been developed to the idea that we had a clear-cut period of social democracy between the 1940s and 70s, and then a period of neoliberalism since the 1980s, of more liberalised, more unequal, more privatised economies. Another version of Britain in this period is post-imperial decline, in a Marxist form articulated by Tom Nairn and Perry Anderson in their thesis about the end of imperial Britain and the breakup of the British state. And in Corelli Barnett's more right-wing conservative form, the idea that Britain wasted an opportunity at the end of the Second World War when it could have spent money on productive industry and investment and instead wasted it on things like schools, hospitals, and better conditions for workers. More recently, I think there's been 2 correctives to that. Jim Tomlinson's argument that Britain experienced not decline, but deindustrialisation and a transition to an economy dominated by services, a common experience, in fact, across advanced economies, I think is an important alternative. And that's connected to David Edverkin's argument that what we saw between the 1940s and 70s was neither consensus nor decline, but actually a form of industrial economic nationhood, which was distinctive to Britain's more global economic orientation before and after that time period. Social and cultural historians have instead focused on conditions and change in everyday life. I know that Florence Sutcliffe-Braithwaite was here with Natalie Tomlinson recently discussing her book on women in the miners' strike, and she's been an important contributor to a version of British history in this time period that centres on the end of structures of deference and authority, and the assertion instead of forms of popular individualism that are less restricted by traditional ties of community. Selina Todd, by contrast, has underlined continuities in hierarchy, class, and inequalities in power relations in Britain in the 20th century. So where does energy fit in here? I think I'm putting forward a different story, a different meta-narrative that nevertheless has a symbiosis or connection with those other big stories. So I argue that energy workers and their work regimes are central to understanding the transformation of Britain in this time period. That because of the central role that energy workers have in the wider structure of the industrial and then increasingly deindustrial economy, what happens to them in their struggles is centrally important in setting the tone for the rest of the economy, as important ripple effects. And it's also the case that the forms of technology that we rely on, the forms of systems that we rely on to generate energy, have a similar structuring impact on the rest of society. My background lies in researching the end of Scottish coal mining, which I argue was a long process that took place across the second half of the 20th century. That became my first book, Coal Country, The Meaning and Memory of Deindustrialisation in Post-War Scotland. You can download it for free online, so I don't feel too bad selling it a bit here. But what I'm going to talk about today is actually research that came after this. It's work that I began in 2022 as part of a British Academy Fellowship that focuses on the expanding and diversifying energy economy in Britain since the 1940s. Today I'm going to tell you a story that's about Britain, and by that I specifically mean Scotland, England and Wales. I have actually studied electricity production in Northern Ireland, and it's a very distinctive story in terms of not having a domestic coal supply, having a totally different structure of ownership, and also a very different set of labour movement politics. So I think it makes sense to think here about Scotland, England and Wales. The research combines archival work from the records of industry, of government, and of organised labour and trade unions. It combines these with testimonies that I've recorded with a broad range of people. I've recorded around 70 interviews, primarily with former workers, members of their families, and other people that have grown up around localities that were shaped by coal mining, electricity generation, the nuclear industry, and oil and gas production. So I've chosen in particular in this presentation to privilege the voice of workers from these testimonies. So we begin then. Why did I begin with 1947 to 8? Why did I say this starts in the late 1940s? This is a period that's marked by the nationalisation of coal and electricity. Now, if you remember back to that graph, coal was overwhelmingly important. Britain is a coal economy at this point. So bringing coal into public ownership is effectively bringing the basic form of energy supply into the hands of the government in 1947. As you may be aware, you may have heard the stories about flags being unfurled at collieries to mark the inauguration of the National Coal Board, the formation of a structure of negotiation between workers and management and committees that met from workplace level upwards, an industry that had a new level of participation and acknowledgement for workers which was distinctive in the context of Britain's economy. This was accompanied also the year after by the nationalisation of electricity production. The new chair of the nationalised electricity industry was Walter Citrine, who was a former electrician from Merseyside, who went on to become the General Secretary of the Trade Union Congress and then was asked by the Labour government to head up the new authority. Writing in his former union journal in 1948, ahead of nationalisation, he presented public ownership as a historic victory for the labour movement, explaining that the system of consultation and negotiation that had been established alongside public ownership gave a whole new role for democratic representatives. It was a recognition of workers' rights that have been sought for decades, in his view, since the trade union movement had begun in the early 19th century. These new enterprises, it was hoped, would form this spirit of cooperation and rationalisation. It was a period when British industry was increasingly hungry for energy, when coal production was required to quite literally keep the lights on in the context of coal shortages in the late 1940s, and when electricity production became increasingly important. And we can see that on this graph, only the second one and the last one, that from 1950 until 1970, electricity production goes up 5 times over. So this is the point where British society becomes electricity dependent in a way that it simply hadn't been before. And it's important to think about what this means. It means fridges and hoovers in people's homes. It means people get to watch England lift the World Cup in their homes. It means factories that are powered by electricity. It means hospitals that have got life support machines and dialysis machines. You know, the basic character of Britain's economy, its welfare state and daily life are being reshaped. And they're being reshaped in an economy that's characterised by trade union recognition and expanded public ownership. And they're also being reshaped by communities that have been reformed rather than formed in the first place, I think, in most cases, around these new demands of electricity production. One example of that is the new mining settlement of Ballingry that's established in West Fife in the 1940s and 1950s. So 3 former mining villages, Lochore, Cross Hill and Glencraig, were demolished. These were old houses that were seen as decrepit, that had been built by mine owners in the late 19th and early 20th century, and they were replaced by the new houses that you can see in this image. They were replaced and structured on a line that demonstrated the important role of the industry to a community at this point in time. I interviewed Mary Lockhart a couple of years ago, not far from Ballingry, where she still lives, and she explained that she grew up in the late 1950s and early 1960s in the midst of a social experiment, that miners were housed in these houses, pit deputies were found a specific row of what were viewed as slightly better, more prestigious houses to mark their place in the workplace, and that her family, she was a miner's granddaughter and a teacher's daughter, they were given one of the corner houses. The corner houses were given mod cons like telephones. And what this meant was that she had queues of miners and their families at her door every day, leaving 2 pence down by the mantelpiece so that they could use the telephone. So this is the new structure of the society that was being built around the expanding demand for energy generation. It was marked then by both an increasing prosperity and also a form of rationalisation. So while coal production was increasing into the late 1950s, when it began, as we saw in that graph, to be replaced and challenged by oil, electricity production, as we saw, kept going up. But the number of power stations actually diminished significantly in this time period. Production was concentrated in a smaller number of units and concentrated geographically. Particularly, it was concentrated around the River Trent in the Midlands in what became known as Megawatt Valley, around settlements that were on a similar line to Ballingry, constructed around the needs of coal mining on the one hand and power generation on the other. I interviewed Richard Bottrell, who was a second-generation Drakelow power station engineer last year. And he explained to me that in the village he grew up in the East Midlands, the houses had been built by the local authority and the Central Electricity Generating Board, that along with his own father, it was common for him to socialise and grow up with other families that had connections with the power station. Richard actually began an apprenticeship in Birmingham in the early 1970s, but quickly lost his job opportunity in the context of industrial recession and a poor economic outlook. And he found economic security at Drakelow with the CEGB, where he was put through formal educational qualifications, eventually having been an apprentice craft worker, graduating with a degree from university. I think there's an interesting tension between the celebration of technology and affluence on the one hand, and the benefits of electricity production, and also the way that former workers and their contemporary trade unions underlined the continuing importance of manual human labour to making electricity generation possible. John Harvey, who left the declining coalfields of northeast of England, of Durham, in the late 1950s, explained to me in some correspondence we had 2 years ago that he became an engineer at Didcot Power Station in Oxfordshire, and he actually worked around far greater volumes of coal than his father and his male relatives had been mining. He was responsible for huge train loads that could bring 1,500 tonnes of coal at the power station at a time, which were then directly mechanically conveyed into the power station. But that left men like himself to actually make very quick repairs, because these were then replaced 20 minutes at a time. So there's very demanding regimes of human labour attached to these seemingly mechanised processes of electrification. Alongside the continued use of coal in new environments, we also in this period lived through the introduction of new forms of energy generation. Most dramatically, the introduction of nuclear technologies. And interestingly, these occur in areas which are often characterised at this time as declining former industrial economies. The most dramatic case of that is Cumbria in northwest England. I came through there on the train actually this morning on the way down here. Cumbria was the site of the first nuclear generation in Britain. What were known as piles at the time that were constructed for the nuclear project at Sellafield. In the early 1950s, the workers that had been recruited from across the country and brought to Sellafield to join a workforce that largely consisted of former miners and other local workers were characterised in the press as enjoying a level of economic affluence. So the Sunday Express wrote this quite charming article on the 18th of May 1951 where they said, on a desolate wedge of bleak Cumberland coast, 3,000 workmen are drawing the fattest pay packets in Britain. They talked about these men in suits waiting on the platform at the train station on their way back to London with wallets full of money and lots of purpose about them. Joe Bell, who's a second-generation Sellafield worker, explained that the place took on the character of what was known as the Gold Coast locally in the early 1950s. His father abandoned the coal mines in order to take up employment opportunity in the nuclear industry, and Joe was quite forthright about the purpose at this point of this site, that Sellafield in the late 40s and early 1950s was primarily about generating nuclear material for one purpose, for the purpose of atomic bomb making. And he described how even when he began working in nuclear processing at Sellafield, which remains the key site for processing Britain's nuclear waste to this day, that he was surrounded by men who had military backgrounds, including men in the hierarchy, that there was an expectation and an attachment between the technological project of nuclear power generation on the one hand and the military ambitions attached to it on the other. Other workers, though, see this as a story of transition and even progress. Natural progression was the phrase that Roger Denwood, the GMB convener at Sellafield, who's a miner's son and his older brother worked in the iron and steel industry, explained in 2022. He saw Sellafield as having given a new generation of industrial life to a declining region. And I think you can see the attachment to these nascent forms of technology in the trade unionism associated with Sellafield. So this is the Unite banner that commemorates the site, in particular the iconic sphere, the so-called golf ball of the AGR, the Advanced Cool Reactor model, which was pioneered at Sellafield before it was rolled out across Britain in the 1960s, 70s and 80s. But another crucial element of labour, aside from the direct activities of electricity production, coal production, of energy generation, was construction. This was a period of massive building sites and rebuilding that reached a zenith in the power station construction sites of the mid-1960s. We might well be familiar with the sense that in the mid-1960s, Harold Wilson's Labour government was agonised by what it saw as the spread of workplace distrust and strikes in car factories or amongst the seamen in 1966. But actually, one of the most important areas was building, and the sense that Britain really needed these power stations to be completed to expand production. One key example of this was the building site at Fiddler's Ferry, not too far from here, in the northwest of England, adjacent to Merseyside. And interestingly, I think it's a story that challenges some of our picture of this period as one of affluence and economic security. It was a dispute that involved bricklayers and which was triggered by the use of subcontracted labour, an ever-present problem in British workplaces, in particular in the construction trade. As a result of the use of subcontracted labour, the Amalgamated Union of Building Trade Workers pulled out its workforce. And it in fact used strict instructions through its own rule book to ensure that bricklayers were left the site in protest at the use of what they called scabs and fly-by-night firms, specifically a firm that was called Emerald Construction. And I think there's an interesting element of trade consciousness and identity to this story as well from 1965. A Merseyside branch official from the union explained that the director of the firm wasn't a skilled worker. He wasn't a bricklayer. He was a hod carrier, which is ridiculous. There must be some dignity in this industry. So there's a sense of arguing in favour of some form of recognition and industrial order, and an expectation that the Central Electricity Generating Board will use big contractors rather than small firms with exploitative labour practices. This is a serious dispute which continually rages on the site across the autumn of 1965 and into 1966, and actually ends in a High Court judgment where a judge rules ultimately against the union. But it agonises the Electricity Generating Board to feel that progress at Fiddler's Ferry and other key sites are being disrupted by daily workplace battles within the construction industry. The other major growth sector, along with nuclear, that I highlighted at the beginning was hydrocarbons, was the coming of oil and gas. And again, this is associated with construction and new sites and new workplaces. So in order for that growth in oil production and consumption to be possible, refineries are built and grow. That includes the Stanlow refinery, not too far from here, the expansion of Grangemouth in central Scotland, but also the expansion of the Isle of Grain on the Thames estuary. This is, I think, a particularly important story. The Isle of Grain on the one hand and Folly and Southampton on the other are important oil refineries because they become associated with competition with coal. In the mid-1950s onwards, until the early 1970s, there's a motivation that's very apparent in Department for Energy deliberations, especially under Conservative governments, to try and use oil, largely imported at this point from the Middle East, as an alternative to coal. It's argued by civil servants that oil will break the miners' stranglehold. That's not a summary, that's a direct quote that's used more than once in relation to oil and gas. This is from the mid-1950s, this quote, when after an unofficial walkout in the Yorkshire coalfield and an official railway strike in 1955, there's a sense of optimism in British industry because oil has successfully replaced coal. Oil was moved not by rail, but by tanker, by road. So there's a sense of avoiding a problematic group of workers underground and a problematic group of workers in transport for using oil. And oil is spread to power stations at this point. So the future of coal comes under threat at this point. And there's political as well as economic motivations at work there. Nevertheless, we see here a continued strong symbiosis that while between coal and electricity, so while there is an expansion of oil-fired electricity, while the nuclear project takes place, while coal is being displaced in the home, in transport, in industry, it remains centrally important to electricity at a time when electricity has never been more important to British life. And I think that's really important for understanding the energy economy of this time period, and especially for understanding workers' power in Britain in the 1970s. There's a very good history of Britain in the 1970s by the journalist Andy Beckett, and it's titled When the Lights Went Out. If we think of one way of thinking about Britain in the 1970s is people using candles and not being able to turn on their lights. Certainly in the first half of the 1970s, that's a politically animating feature. I want to highlight two instances of that here. So I think what we have in this context is nationalised utility workers demanding affluence. Essentially workers, not just in coal mines, but also in power stations and electricity supply, feel that they've actually fallen behind. They're not earning the wages that would allow them to live the lifestyle of car ownership, television ownership, foreign holidays that is increasingly being marketed as conducive to the affluent worker at this time. And the first of these is a less well-known dispute, and I'm surprised actually by how much it appears to have fallen out of popular memory. It's the electricity work to rule of December 1970. In December 1970, on the 7th of December 1970 to be specific, electricity workers turned up for work as usual, and yet nevertheless within a few days they sent rolling blackouts across Britain. They'd engaged in working to rule, so they were refusing to take on extra activities or exercise workplace flexibility or work overtime in pursuit of a wage claim. This had quite immediate, quite dramatic consequences, and it was roundly condemned by government. Anthony Barber, the Conservative Chancellor, and Ted Heath's government said that the nation was being held to ransom. And sections of public opinion responded accordingly, actually. Electricity workers were spat at, were shot at with shotguns on occasion, were subject to being refused service in shops, were demonised in the press. And yet afterwards, a court of inquiry was called under Lord Wilberforce, who was a descendant of the famous Wilberforce, interestingly enough. And it actually gave considerable concessions in wages and other conditions to electricity workers. This was seen as a victory by trade unions, who pointed out that, in fact, government had tried to rely on troops and other emergency responses, but had been unable to do so. It had exposed the importance of the electricity workforce and electricity production to contemporary society as well as the economy. I think the better known strike that put the lights out in Britain is the miners' strikes of 1972 and 1974. And actually, in many ways, they share very common features of the electricity work to rule. Essentially, these are disputes that are about electricity. They're about the movement of coal into power stations and the blockading of that movement and the exercise of worker solidarity actually in the power industry by lorry drivers, by port workers and others. This picture is from Long Annet Power Station in Fife, not that far from Ballingry. It's part of the National Union of Mine Workers Scottish area blockade of the power station in 1972. These strikes, like the power workers dispute, were successful. And the end of this period is a reinforcement of the logic of the national energy economy in the 1974 Plan for Coal, which commits to investment in new colliery production and to maintaining high levels of coal burning in Britain's power station generation. The context for this is that oil has become politically unreliable, that in the early 1970s, particularly the Arab oil producers and OPEC responded to the Arab-Israeli War of 73 by imposing an oil embargo on certain Western nations. And that created a context where oil prices became much higher, oil became less competitive, but I think more importantly, oil became seen as politically unreliable as well, which increased the power and influence of domestic production. Another important outcome of that context of oil in the 1970s is suddenly oil that's beneath the choppy, difficult waters of the North Sea becomes very, very desirable. North Sea oil was discovered in British territorial waters in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And a new infrastructure of advanced technology, which has been compared to the space race and its implications, these huge new offshore rigs, which are much bigger than any rigs that have ever been built before. They're in fact the largest human-made moving objects in the world at the time, become important features of Britain's energy economy and the political imagination as well. They're also exceedingly dangerous places to work at this point in time. Over the year 1975 to 1976, the death rate for North Sea divers was 1%. 1 in 100 divers died offshore around that time. I've got some quotes from North Sea workers here, which I think just give us an idea of what it was like working offshore. The new industry was dominated by the majors, so by BP and Shell with British connections on the one hand, but also by the 5 large American companies on the other. Neil Rothney was a young man from Buckie, a fishing village in the northeast of Scotland, who began working offshore in 1973. And he explained that they were being inducted effectively into the industry by young men from the south of America who were actually not much older than he was, in a very dangerous environment where production rather than safety was the priority. And he described there was no toleration of trade unions offshore at this point, and that actually these Americans were not shy of handing out. Neil was coy about this. He said, well, I wouldn't exactly call it violence, but they certainly hit you a bit. And he described one American who brandished what Neil wasn't sure if it was a real or fake newspaper that had a story about a black man in the south of the United States being chained and thrown into a delta. So this was the atmosphere of the offshore rig and the culture that it's produced. I recorded another story from Danny Carrigan, who was an electrician who worked offshore in the late 1970s on the Brent Bravo platform in the North Sea. He'd previously worked in shipyards in Glasgow. He knew the contracting electricity world quite well, but he explained that he'd never worked in an environment like this before. He was doing maintenance work, having to live on a barge and being transported daily to the platform by helicopters, by bored pilots that would regularly fly in very funny and awkward ways to scare their passengers. And he also described what I think sounds like a terrifying incident. He explained he was doing this maintenance work at the bottom of a leg of a platform and that it caught fire. There was some rags at the bottom next to him caught fire. And he had to rush hundreds of feet up this platform. And on the way up, he was met by this slow, bumbling older worker, and that he simply rushed up past them, and that it was absolutely terrifying. He said it was unbelievable, and it put him off ever working again. Well, he did end up later offshore as part of union safety delegations. Offshore oil in the 1970s into the early 1980s was a national energy project. And it brought huge new forms of production. It brought heavy industry to the Scottish Highlands and Islands and Aberdeenshire, places that had rarely experienced these sort of activities before. Perhaps the most dramatic example of that is another construction site story. It's the story of Sullom which is a northern inlet in the Shetland Islands, the most northernly British territory. And it became Europe's largest oil and gas terminal. The way offshore production and technologies worked at the time, it was absolutely essential that pipelines were grouped through Shetland. And as a result, an island which had a population of around 16,000 people in the early 1970s had a population of around 30,000 people in the early 1980s. This was seen as an essential project to helping Britain out of its economic woes and realising net self-sufficiency in oil. And I think you can see the national importance that was articulated around Sullom in this image. It comes from the Shetland Times. It's from a commemorative edition that marks the opening of Sullom by the Queen in 1981. The Shetland Times published a booklet which had a foreword by the Energy Secretary at the time. And you can see here hard hats and Union flags. This was into the early Thatcher era, but nevertheless, at this point, BP was still a majority publicly owned enterprise. And in his account of overseeing the project, BP's site manager, Ted Ferguson, talked about how he had to work with the unions. How actually the unions were very, very important to creating a sense of discipline and order amongst a workforce that was drawn from all over the UK and from across Ireland as well, for that matter. That's not to say that there weren't disputes over the course of the building this workplace between the early 70s and the early 80s. There were strikes by construction workers which achieved improvements in pay and conditions. These were primarily men who were living in camps, after all, that were provided by the company. There were strikes by camp staff, which included large contingents of women from the islands earning what were at the time seen as very, very high wages, but also men and women from across Scotland and Britain. There were also disputes by dockers, particularly local dockers in Lerwick, Shetland's main port, who went on strike to ensure that they had privileged access to the jobs that were going to be created out of the oil industry at a time when this was clearly going to be the future for the island's economy. I think the other thing I'd highlight here is there's a story of nationhood here, but there's a story of international mobility as well. I interviewed a camp chamber worker called David Watt, who was a qualified teacher who couldn't get a job in the late 70s and early 80s in Glasgow. So he went up to Shetland, worked at the camp, talked about how he used to get up next to workers that worked in the construction trade who were opening copies of the Financial Times to find out where the next job was going to be in the oil and gas industry. And he actually followed a group of them to Western Australia and said he earned more money working offshore there than he ever did as a teacher when he came back to Glasgow. I've interviewed other workers that had connections to Sullom that ended up in the Caspian, that worked in North America. So it's this gateway to this liberalised oil and gas sector of the late 20th and 21st century. So I talked about this early Thatcher period, this period where the North Sea still had a certain amount of national project investment associated with it. And one part of that was, in fact, the British National Oil Corporation. The British government owned oil platforms in the North Sea and had ambitions to develop a publicly owned sector, just as it did in electricity and gas and coal at this time. I interviewed Herbie Gibson, who was a senior economist at BNOC, which was headquartered in Glasgow in the early 1980s, and he explained that he was surrounded on the one hand by people that thought that oil was a windfall national industry. It needed to be used in a way that created jobs and that also created sustainable economic changes in Britain. But he also explained how BNOC was contested territory, that in fact he was also surrounded by personnel who had a background in the private oil industry, who wanted BNOC to be run like any other private oil company. And quite quickly it was. BNOC was privatised in the first Thatcher government between 79 and 83. It was quite tellingly replaced by a company called Enterprise Oil, which maybe says it all. And Nigel Lawson, pictured here, waving the money, was first Energy Secretary, then Chancellor in the Thatcher government. And in 1982, he gave a speech where he disavowed the idea of energy policy, that idea of having a national energy economy that had been so influential in British energy policy making and in workers' lives and experiences between the 40s and the 70s was disowned. Specifically, Lawson disowned the idea that it was advantageous or secure to have energy production being orientated toward domestic needs. He argued that actually whether Britain was a net energy importer or exporter was unimportant, and primarily he underlined that it was not the role of government, in his view, to intervene in or structure demand for energy, that this should be left to market forces as he saw it. In 1981, Lawson and Thatcher's government entered their first confrontation with the coal miners on the lines of realising this sort of national energy policy. It was based on the Coal Board announcing a series of major closures. Significantly, on this occasion, as a strike spread across the British coalfield, the government actually backed down. They weren't prepared at that point for a strike. As we know, 3 or 4 years later, they were. Coal had been stockpiled, oil imports were ready, the oil price had fallen significantly from where it had been in the late 70s and early 80s. And Britain had, through its new oil capacity, through its new nuclear capacity, enough electricity capacity along with imported coal and stocked coal to keep the lights on, which is a very different context from the early 1970s. The Thatcher government also continued to sponsor the building of nuclear power stations, which runs contra to the overall idea of not having a national energy policy. These were units that were only viable in the context of a national energy policy and deciding that there was advantages to having this sort of domestically rooted, nationally owned production. This is a scene from North Wales. It's those concrete blocks I showed you earlier, Trawsfynydd Nuclear Power Station. This is the summer of 1984. And I think it's quite a revealing scene in terms of the deconstruction of the national energy economy. So rather than coordination between coal and nuclear, you have coal versus nuclear in quite a dramatic form. Miller Thomas is he's the son of David Eli Thomas, who was a Plaid Cymru MP on the left of the party, a supporter of the miners in the 1984 strike. And Miller remembered, when I interviewed him in 2022, miners sleeping in his dad's living room at the time and then going out to picket the power station. And he remembered that they, on the most dramatic occasion, miners from South Wales actually tried to blockade the train that transported nuclear waste from Trawsfynydd to Sellafield to stop the reactor from working. Rory Trapp was a craft worker in the power station at the time, and he remembered the tensions around this. he was and still was when I interviewed him in 2022 a trade unionist, a believer in public ownership and a believer in a coordinated energy policy. But he found himself getting jeered at by miners from South Wales when he was going into work and felt, I think there's clearly contradictions in tension between these stances. So we see, and I think it's important to think not just about the end in 1984-5. This isn't a story that ends solely or purely with the defeat of the miners in 1985. Actually, the deconstruction of that system of integrated coal mining, rail production and electricity production takes time. In Central Electricity Generating Board internal briefings that I read from the late 1980s, as the board was preparing for the new life of a privatised energy sector, they targeted the benefits of nationalisation for workers as something that needed to be gotten rid of. So managers were told that the problem with the board was that it had been total employment, it had provided cradle-to-grave employment for workers across their lifetime. These had been basic principles. Instead, the aim was to shed labour in large number. So the aim was to identify activities where massive capital investment could reduce manpower. The other aim was to get rid of systems of employee representation. So those structures of consultation, which did exist from workplace level, at local and regional level and national level within the board, were seen as a disadvantage. The trade union alternative, the Fuse campaign, ran on the slogan, "Keep power with the people." And it was also affiliated with campaigns like the Power Valley campaign in South Yorkshire that linked railway workers, miners and power station workers and their unions in a campaign to preserve these forms of domestic production. I think, interestingly, the end of that old form, the form of the energy economy that had been dominant in many respects from the 40s into the 80s, was associated on the one hand with changes in workplace relations and power, but also with technology. Richard Bottrell remembered that his father simply left the electricity industry, retired early and took redundancy because he was appalled by the idea of what he saw as a publicly owned utility being used for profit making. In several interviews, workers, actually across industries, but especially in the former publicly owned power industry, have talked about what they see as the rise of accountants. The end of industries that, yes, were very hierarchical, but were also ran with the logics of trade union recognition and technical expertise and a recognition of skill, being replaced by a regime that was centred on accounting and finance at its centre. In one interview, I also had to record a gas worker lambasting what he called uni boys for about 2 hours, which was somebody with 3 degrees. It was studying and doing these interviews for oral histories for a university project. It was quite good fun. Roger, who had a slightly more bird's eye view than Richard, who was a former engineering union official, explained that thousands and thousands of people simply lost their jobs. It was no longer a comfortable industry. And these changes were associated with changes in technology and regulation. So in the late 1980s into the early 1990s, combined cycle gas turbines start to pop up across the British landscape. If we think about that graph I showed you at the start, where gas has become the most important fuel in 2000, it's because of sites like this. This is Roosecote, the first new gas power station that was opened in the early 1990s. Gas power stations required a lot less workers than coal power stations. New workplaces weren't subject to the expectations of old workplaces. They weren't connected to the old networks of the coal-fired economy. It was actually a considerable legislative change over the late 80s and early 90s that allowed gas to be burned in British power stations. Before that, the argument had been that North Sea gas was best allocated for domestic and industrial use, that power stations should be used for coal. That was the logic of the national energy economy, which of course had been demolished over the previous decade. So we have here then social, economic and political changes that are animated by evolving forms of energy generation and the workplace relations that take place within those forms of generation. A distinctive national energy economy from the 40s to the 80s was characterised by public ownership, national coordination and systems of union recognition. Workers invested in and defended the national energy economy in the 1970s, 1980s, into the 1990s. It was dismantled and replaced with a privatised order where financial imperatives, union disrecognition, and the ownership of Britain's energy economy by privately listed multinationals, and in some cases actually state-owned enterprises from other countries, has become a dominant feature. Thanks very much.
Brilliant, thank you, Ewan. Does anyone have a question for Ewan?
It might not be the right question, this, but what do you see of the future of the gas industry regarding, you know, hydrogen and things like that? Because I used to be shop steward in the gas. I'm president of the Liverpool and Irish GMB union, and we went to this hydrogen villages. There's one in Ellesmere Port and there's one in Redcar, and they were both abandoned. You know, they took the funding out of them. They said they weren't viable. So I was wondering if you had any opinions on that. Because what we feel is, sorry, I'm waffling on a little bit. We've been to meetings in the coal industry. We've had our guys who said the gas industry, we're going to end up like the coal board with no workers if we don't have some sort of alternative as opposed to the green. Because hydrogen would be a green gas.
I think it's an important question, and I think it comes back to the central question of what is government going to do about that? What decisions are we going to make around hydrogen and its place? Certainly in Scotland, hydrogen is being very actively championed by the Scottish Government at the moment, but key workplaces like Grangemouth refinery, its future is in the balance at the moment as a petroleum manufacturing related site, and one of the hopes is that it could become a hydrogen fueled site. There's hopes that, particularly because Britain has an excess of wind, effectively, that to some extent you could produce green hydrogen from that, and that would be advantageous. I think the biggest problem is the lack of investment in infrastructure, regardless of what infrastructures it is that we want. That we've kind of done the easy bit of that, particularly in Scotland, but even across the UK now. Larger and larger amounts of our electricity are generated by wind, and there's bad things about how that's been done, but it's a good change from the carbon emissions that we had before. But the more difficult changes, the more difficult transitions are the ones that are going to happen in our homes and in transport, and that's going to require, I think, much more definite decisions, like the ones that were made in the past around electrification or around the conversion of our homes from coal-derived town gas to natural gas that you're probably very familiar with.
Maybe a slightly random question. So I play in brass bands, and it's not a coincidence that the heart of the brass banding movement is centred around the coal fields. You know, that's been a profound cultural impact that's arisen because of the concentration of the people and the infrastructure that those people have built to create a culture of music, education, to improve workers. So what's I guess you focus on the economic side, but those cultural effects, how do those tie into all of these choices that have been made through the decades?
I think that's a really interesting question. It was, in some ways, in my book on the coalfields, I think about some of these themes in relation to sporting associations and miners' welfares and associational lives. I think, interestingly, in some of the more recent research I've presented here, is we actually see some continuities of that. There's, for instance, in Sellafield in Cumbria, there's a large sports association that's associated with the nuclear industry, that's logo features atoms and looks kind of futuristic and exciting, and in the way that the past made things look futuristic. But you know, that still exists to this day, and it runs important sport and leisure centres in West Cumbria. And I don't think it's an accident that happened in somewhere that had a large coal mining sector and then built this new large workplace, energy workplace under state guidance. There's also a strong connection between social activities actually and the electricity generating board. There's a great picture of, and I'm going to get the power station wrong, but they used to play sports leagues and cricket tournaments around the power stations in the Trent Valley, and there's a picture that's from 2018 or 2019, and I think it's either Eggborough or Ferrybridge C, and it's quite recent. It looks like a really old picture because they've got these giant cooling towers and these guys playing cricket, but it's from quite recently. So I guess something I'm interested in thinking about there is actually the persisting cultural influences of these associations, and actually the fact that the coal age is only just ending now. While the coal mining age has been over for longer, you know, the wider infrastructures of coal in Britain are only just coming to an end, really.
Time for one more question.
Just sorry to take up this here. How is the gas and social obviously privatisation, the whole thing once you've got not one people left. Which is always a sad
thing. I mean, it's good to hear that the clubs and things are still going. Do you think that the sort of dismantling under Thatcher has actually stopped people's motivation? Has it split people up and stopped them being as unified generally, and got more competition between people rather than them working together?
I think that was definitely the objective. I think they certainly succeeded in breaking key areas of workers' power. You know, I think that's the biggest negative outcome that we see here, is that certain bases of industrial strength that had implications beyond the immediate workplaces but for the wider structure of the economy are removed from British public life, British political life, as well as British industrial and economic life. On the other hand, what I'm interested in more positively, I think, thinking about is, you know, the objective of saying there should be no such thing as energy policy, of insisting that energy is just the same as like Heinz beans or, you know, I don't know, pens or something that anybody can make in exchange and doesn't have any important properties. That, you know, that's the implication of the Thatcherite position of the Nigel Lawson speech from 1982. That's not succeeded. We actually saw the most Thatcherite Prime Minister since Thatcher have to dramatically intervene in the energy economy in 2022. Liz Truss setting the cap on consumer costs because energy is understood to have political properties, and because we don't actually consider energy, especially electricity and gas, we don't think that they're just a good like any other. We think they're a public good, and we think people have a right to them at an affordable price. And I think it's interesting that despite all their successes, that doesn't seem to have been one of them.
Final question?
The nearest parallel to what has been the experience of the construction of the oil industry is and is in Norway, I think. And I wonder to what extent the fact that they've ended up putting massive amounts of money into these funds to partly to underpin their economy, but also to demonstrate to us to some extent a different way.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, there was actually a debate in the Labour government in the 1970s about having a fund. So it's not that nobody in Britain thought that was possible. Tony Benn was Energy Secretary in the late 1970s, and across a number of areas he was in quite persistent conflict with the oil majors, who I think it's fair to say had sympathisers or allies in some ways in their perspective within the Department for Energy. Certainly in the sense that the objective of British government at large was to get oil out of the ground as quickly as possible to meet Britain's balance of payments and economic difficulties at the time. Ben argued that oil revenues should be siphoned off in some way and used for special purposes. There were arguments about a fund on the Norwegian lines later, but Ben wanted specifically to use it to invest in industrial retraining, industrial skills and a new industrial base, which it is worth remembering the Norwegians only ventured on that decision relatively late. It was in the early 90s that they started their fund. I think it's an important point. I think it's inarguable that North Sea oil was a historic opportunity for Britain that was used well. I guess it wasn't squandered from the point of view of the people who enjoyed the benefits of privatisation, growing economic inequalities, spiralling property prices, and paying for mass unemployment and a weakened trade union movement. I mean, that was what North Sea oil paid for ultimately. So I worry that renewables is also a historical opportunity and of a different sort that, we're not necessarily seeing the full benefits of either.